Why the Special Air Service always beats American Special Forces in close quarters. Here is a question that nobody in Washington particularly enjoys answering, and honestly, it is one of those questions where the more you look into it, the more uncomfortable the answer gets for the Americans. If you take the best special forces America produces, give them the best equipment money can buy, train them longer and harder than almost any other military in the world, and then put them in the same building as a four-man Special Air Service patrol, the building tends to go one way. And it has been going that way for a very long time now. The Falklands, Malaya, the Iranian Embassy in 1980, where the Special Air Service ended a 19-day siege in 17 minutes on live television, while the American rescue operation that same year ended in a desert with 8 body bags. Basra, in 2005, where 2 men were brought home in 11 minutes, after London had already told the squadron to stand down. Now, before anyone gets defensive, the answer is not about courage, not about fitness, and not even about who has the better rifle, despite what the equipment catalogues might suggest. The answer goes considerably deeper than any of that. And honestly, it does not matter what decade you look at, or which theatre, or which enemy, or even what kit both sides were carrying at the time. Blimey, the outcome in close quarters just keeps going the same way. So the question is, why? That is what we are going to get into today. And we will start where everyone starts, when they want to give America the benefit of the doubt. The training. Is it because of the training? The Americans always claimed they train harder and longer than almost anyone. So why does it not translate? Right, so the easy assumption, and the one Americans reach for first, is that this must be a training problem. The Special Air Service trains harder, more specifically for close quarters work, and that is why they perform better at it. This assumption is wrong. But it is wrong in an interesting way. American Special Forces training is, by volume and resource, genuinely impressive. A Navy SEAL candidate who makes it through basic underwater demolition goes through approximately a year of initial training before being assigned to a team. Green Berets spend somewhere between 12 and 18 months in the qualification pipeline. Delta Force operators go through a program so intensive that its details are still largely classified. The Americans have invested more money, more time, and more institutional thought into training their special forces than any military in history. Here is the problem, though. Training volume is not the same thing as training for the right thing. When Colonel Charles Beckwith came back from Hereford in 1962, he spent 15 years trying to explain this to the American military and getting precisely nowhere. He did not tell them the Special Air Service trained more. He told them they trained differently. They trained for conditions where the framework collapses, where the plan has gone wrong, where the man on the ground is the only decision-making authority available, and he needs to be right immediately without phoning anyone. Meanwhile, American training, Beckwith kept saying, was brilliant at producing men who performed at maximum capacity inside a functioning system. The problem was what happened when the system stopped functioning. When the radio went down, when the intelligence was wrong, when the building had a fourth room that the satellite imagery missed, and when London told you to stand down and you knew, with the specific certainty of a man who is actually in Basra rather than Chelsea, that standing down meant 2 men in a box before morning. The American training pipeline had no module for that. Not because nobody had thought of it, because the American military preferred to solve that problem by making the system more reliable rather than training men to operate without it. More communications, better intelligence, more assets on call. The answer to the system failing was always just make the system less likely to fail. The Special Air Service took the opposite view. The system will fail. It always fails. Train for that. This is not a small philosophical difference. It is the entire ballgame. And the Vietnam War is the clearest evidence of this. By 1967, American special operations teams running reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines were being detected, tracked, and ambushed at rates that the after-action reports describe in the careful language of military bureaucracy as unsustainable. The detection was not coming from enemy technology or superior intelligence. It was coming from sound. The specific, low-level, continuous acoustic signature that 6 men carrying nearly 200 kilograms of collective equipment generates simply by moving through dense vegetation. Metal clips against buckles, nylon webbing against bark, hard-soled boots on roots. The Australians, who had trained directly with the Special Air Service through joint operations in Borneo, were running the same missions in the same theatre at roughly double the American success rate. Lower movement, lighter loads, taped buckles, canvas instead of metal, soft soles, and above all, the patience that looked from the outside like paralysis until you understood it was the single factor most likely to determine whether the patrol came home. Now here is the part that stings a little. General Creighton Abrams, the American commander in Vietnam, eventually had to go and request cross-training with Commonwealth units in 1968. The Americans who went through it described it as the most significant tactical shift of their careers, and not because the British were more aggressive, but because the British had been trained for 15 years before the Americans arrived in Vietnam for exactly the environment the Americans were dying in. The training was not harder. It was right. These are different things. The Americans kept confusing them. But all right, maybe it is not the training. So, let us look at the next obvious answer. Oi, the kit. What about the equipment? The Yanks are always boasting about being the most technically advanced military in the world. So why does better kit keep losing to older kit? Right, so if it is not the training, it must be the equipment. Except it very obviously is not the equipment. And this is the part where British military historians have to try quite hard not to smirk. In Helmand, in 2003, 4 Special Air Service soldiers walked off a helicopter carrying 30 kilograms each. The 8 Navy SEALs beside them were carrying 45 kilograms each of the most technologically advanced personal military equipment on Earth. Night vision that turned darkness into daylight. Encrypted radios with satellite uplink. Laser designators. Suppressed rifles with every attachment the American military-industrial complex could engineer onto a weapon. The British had older rifles, simpler radios, and night vision that was, in the words of one American operator who was there, a generation behind. By the end of that night, the American operators were sitting in a plywood debrief room asking the British how they did it. Now look at Basra in 2005. A squadron drove into the city in Pinzgauer carriers fitted with bar armor and electronic countermeasure jammers. Genuinely impressive kit. But the decisive element of that whole operation was not any piece of hardware. It was a major who looked at the clock, looked at 2 beaten soldiers on a television screen and said 7 words. Saddle up. Full squadron. We are going to get our people. No piece of equipment made that decision. Now, this is not an argument that equipment does not matter. It does, and the Special Air Service knows this as well as anyone. If there is better kit available, they use it. The point is that in close quarters combat specifically, the limiting factor is almost never the equipment. The limiting factor is the quality of the decision made in the room when the equipment tells you something unexpected. When the drone misses the dogs sleeping outside the north wall because nobody told it to look outside the north wall. When the plan changes on the ground with no time to call anyone for permission. When the building is not what the intelligence said it was and the man going through the door has about 2 seconds to adjust. The Americans kept building more capable equipment to solve the close quarters problem. The Special Air Service kept building more capable decision makers. These are not the same solution, and one of them works considerably better. There is also a story from the Malaya campaign worth mentioning here because it shows exactly what happens when you rely on what the enemy cannot see rather than what you can buy. By the mid-1950s, Special Air Service 4-man patrols were spending weeks in the deep interior, locating guerrilla camps that battalion sweeps with full air support had completely missed. They were not finding them because they had better surveillance equipment. They were finding them because they moved slowly enough and quietly enough to get within observation distance without being heard first. The guerrillas had, at one point, a standing assumption that any patrol they could hear approaching was not the Special Air Service. The Special Air Service you did not hear until they were already there. That assumption, that practical belief held by the enemy, was worth more than any piece of equipment the regiment could have been issued. Kit is a force multiplier. It multiplies whatever you already have. If what you already have is the right man with the right doctrine, the kit makes him more effective. If what you have is the wrong doctrine delivered by expensive kit, you just get a very expensive wrong doctrine. The Special Air Service figured this out in Malaya. The Americans are still working on it. So we have now ruled out training, and we have ruled out equipment. And we still do not have the answer, which means we need to go deeper, much deeper actually. We already looked at the training and the equipment, and we still do not have the full answer. So the next one is it the selection? What exactly does Helmand find that Fort Bragg does not test for? This is where it gets interesting. And this is where the Americans, to their considerable credit, eventually started paying attention. The Special Air Service selection process is not, despite what the documentaries suggest, primarily a physical test. The physical component is brutal and real, and it destroys candidates by the dozen. But honestly, it is not the point. It is the entrance exam. You have to be fit enough to be in the room. What happens in the room is something else entirely. The selection is built around one specific, uncomfortable question. Can this man function effectively when nobody is telling him whether he is doing it right? That is it. That is the whole thing. Every marsh, every mountain, every weighted Bergen in the rain is a delivery mechanism for that one question. The candidates are given a task and told to do the best they can. No time standard. No feedback at checkpoints. No cadre officer nodding approvingly when you arrive on schedule. The directing staff are specifically trained to give nothing back. Not a raised eyebrow, not a single syllable that tells you whether you are passing or failing. Most men cannot function in that condition. Not because they lack courage or fitness or intelligence, because their entire military career has been built around a system that tells them where they stand. Every evaluation, every promotion, every citation has closed the loop. You performed, the authority assessed, the signal came back. You knew where you stood. The selection removes the signal. And in the silence, it watches what happens. In 1978, Beckwith finally got permission to run American Green Berets through a version of the selection in West Virginia. 163 of America's finest soldiers went in, men with multiple combat tours, silver stars, the kind of decorated records that get you taken seriously in any room. 12 came out. The weapons sergeant, who did not make it, had said beforehand that the maths did not work in the course's favor. He was right about the maths, 163 in, 12 out. He was wrong about what the maths were measuring, though. He assumed it was measuring endurance. It was measuring something considerably rarer. The men who passed were not physically superior. They were not more decorated. They were the ones who could walk into silence and keep walking. That quality is not trainable. It is findable. And finding it, rather than training for it, means the regiment always has a ceiling that no amount of investment in the pipeline can raise. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the thing that makes the Special Air Service selection genuinely unusual. The selection does not produce better soldiers. It finds a specific kind of person and then trains them. That distinction sounds pedantic, but it has enormous practical consequences. If you believe selection produces better soldiers, you build a harder selection, more physical stress, higher standards, longer duration. If you believe selection finds a specific quality, you build a more accurate test for that quality, and you remove everything that measures the wrong things, keeping only what measures the right one. The Special Air Service selection is not particularly long by American standards and not particularly varied either. It is monotonous, cold, heavy and silent, and specifically and deliberately those four things, because those four things combined and sustained are the only reliable method anyone has ever found for identifying men who carry the mission inside themselves, rather than in the support structure around them. You cannot manufacture that quality. You can only search for it. Beckwith described it once in a way that has stuck. The regular army is full of men who think clearly when they are comfortable. I need men who think clearly when they are broken. Those are different men. The Americans eventually understood this. Delta Force selection, modeled directly on the Special Air Service process, is now considered among the most rigorous in the world. But the key word is modeled. The original is still in the Brecon beacons. Like, now. Selection gets us much closer. But it still does not fully explain the close quarters gap. Finding the right men is only half of it. What you do with them after is equally important. And this is where it gets a bit embarrassing for the Americans. Right. So we have ruled out training, we have ruled out equipment, and the selection gets us closer, but still does not fully explain it. So what is left? Oh, the doctrine. And this one, honestly, took the Americans the longest to accept. Doctrine is the word militaries use for the way they think about problems. Not a set of tactics. A set of assumptions about what the problem actually is and what winning looks like. Two units can use identical tactics and completely different doctrine, same way two builders can use identical bricks and produce completely different houses. American close quarters doctrine was built around a principle called violence of action. The idea is simple, and it has genuine merit. When you breach a building, you go in with such overwhelming speed and aggression that the defenders cannot organize a response. You do not give them a second to think. The shock, the noise, the pace, it is itself a weapon. This works brilliantly in a large number of situations, particularly when the intelligence is accurate, the building is as expected, and the number of threats is roughly what the plan assumed. The Special Air Service also uses violence of action. This is not a doctrinal difference about whether to be aggressive. The difference is what happens before the aggression. In Helmand in 2003, the Special Air Service sergeant asked where the dogs were. The drone had given the assault team a complete thermal picture of the compound. 7 heat signatures, 2 sentries. Everything accounted for. The Americans were ready to go. "Where are the dogs?" the sergeant asked. "Every compound in rural Helmand has dogs. If there are no dogs showing on the thermal inside the walls, they are sleeping outside the walls, probably against the north side, where the approach route ran." But nobody had looked. The drone had been pointed at the compound, not the ground around it. One trooper went forward alone, circled wide to the south, came back 15 minutes later. 3 dogs, north wall, sleeping. The assault route changed from north to south. No radio call, no request for permission, no delay, waiting for someone in an air-conditioned operations center to authorize the change. The sergeant made the call. The call! The Americans followed without argument. "Yo!" If the assault had come from the north, the dogs wake, bark, and everyone in the compound reaches for their weapon before the breach team touches the wall. The clean 11-minute operation that followed becomes something much louder, much harder, and considerably less certain. One question, asked by a man with 2 years of operational presence in that country, changed the entire outcome. This is Special Air Service doctrine in its purest form. It is not about being more aggressive than the Americans. It is about being right before the aggression starts. The violence of action comes after the thinking, not instead of it. Now, here is something that almost never gets discussed in the American analysis of all this. The Northern Ireland experience. For nearly 30 years, the Special Air Service operated in a theatre that was simultaneously domestic, politically explosive, and an active insurgency run by an enemy that was intelligent, legally sophisticated, and very well informed about how British forces operated. The Provisional Irish Republican Army was not a Third World militia. It had good intelligence, legal resources, political connections, and a support network that meant every significant British military operation could potentially be observed and reported. The Special Air Service could not operate there the way it operated in the desert or the jungle. Every decision had legal consequences. Every use of force was subject to judicial review. Every operation had to be defensible in a court of law, as well as effective on the ground. This produced something no other operational environment had quite produced in the same way. An entire generation of Special Air Service operators trained to think about the downstream consequences of every decision before making it. Not as a constraint on effectiveness, as part of effectiveness. The Americans, for most of their special forces history, operated in environments where the legal framework was either absent or largely irrelevant. The downstream consequences of a decision were measured purely in operational terms. Did it achieve the objective? The Special Air Service measured them in operational terms and legal terms simultaneously for 30 years until the habit of that dual calculation became doctrinal instinct. In Basra in 2005, Major Carver knew before the operation launched that the intelligence recovery from the compound had to be handled in a way that would be legally defensible. He knew the political consequences were going to be severe, and that the only shield available was an unambiguously successful outcome. The operation was planned with those requirements in mind, not as an afterthought, as part of the doctrine. Sometimes the most important thing a doctrine can give you is the clarity to act when the system around you has chosen not to. The best way to see all of this doctrine in action, the preparation, the thinking before the aggression, the plan within the plan, is to look at one specific operation that your audience almost certainly knows about. And yet, most people have never heard the part of the story that actually explains why it went the way it did. The Iranian Embassy, 1980. The 5th of May, 1980. 6 armed men from the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan had stormed the Iranian Embassy in Prince's Gate, London, 6 days earlier. 26 hostages. 6 days of negotiations that went nowhere. And then, on that 5th of May, the terrorists shot a hostage and threw the body out of a window. At that point, the decision was made. The Special Air Service went in. What the television cameras caught was 17 minutes of controlled chaos. Absil ropes down the building, windows taken out. Stun grenades, smoke. Men in black overalls moving through a building that was on fire. 5 of the 6 terrorists killed, all but 1 hostage recovered alive. What the television cameras did not catch was the 6 days that preceded it. For 6 days, the Special Air Service had been inside the building next door. They had drilled through walls to place listening devices. They had built a scale model of the floor plan, number. They had rehearsed the assault so many times in a nearby barracks that the building was effectively memorized. They knew which rooms the hostages were in, roughly where the terrorists were positioned, where the structural weak points were, where the stairwells ran, and where the windows could be approached from the roof. When the assault went in, it was not improvised. It was the execution of a plan that had been refined over 6 days of intelligence collection and rehearsal. The 17 minutes looked spectacular because the preparation was invisible. This is the thing that American military planners, when they analyzed the Iranian embassy, found genuinely difficult to replicate. Not the assault itself, the preparation culture that produced it. The assumption, built into the Special Air Service doctrine at every level, that the time before the assault is as important as the assault itself. That the man going through the window should already know what is on the other side before he gets there. That is the thing the Americans found genuinely difficult to replicate. And the proof of that, well, it happened the same year. The Americans fought the same enemy, but, oh well, the results were not even close to the level of professionalism of how the Special Air Service carried out their missions. And it was during Operation Eagle Claw. The American operation to rescue the hostages in Tehran that same year failed in the Iranian desert before it even reached the embassy. The post-operation analysis identified multiple contributing factors. What it struggled to articulate was the preparation culture gap. The specific institutional habit of treating the pre-assault phase as the decisive phase, which the Special Air Service had been building since the North African desert in 1941. The Americans learned from Eagle Claw. Delta Force was rebuilt, retrained, restructured, and the lessons were hard and they were taken seriously. But the starting point of those lessons was a deficit that the Special Air Service had been accumulating credit in for 40 years. So now we have the full picture, or most of it. There is one more layer to this. So what is it actually? After all of that, the training, the equipment, the selection, the doctrine, what is the actual answer? The answer is this. In close quarters combat, the decisive factor is not the breach or the kit or even the training volume or even the plan itself. The decisive factor is actually the quality of the decision that gets made in the 5 seconds after everything goes wrong. And in that specific window, the Special Air Service has a structural advantage that no amount of American defense spending has ever managed to close, and not because America lacks the money or the will or the men, but because that advantage was built over 80 years of continuous operational experience in exactly the conditions that produce it, and that kind of experience honestly cannot be purchased or shortcut or replicated in a training facility in Virginia. Here is what those 5 seconds actually looked like in practice. In Basra in 2005, a squadron breached the compound at 01:55 hours. 60 seconds into the assault, a fighter on the roof had a rocket-propelled grenade launcher aimed at the breach point where air troop was flowing through. The Special Air Service sniper, who was positioned on a building 50 meters east, had already been there before the assault even began, specifically because someone had identified that rooftop as a likely threat position during the 6 hours of planning that London had tried to cancel. The fighter with the launcher dropped in a tenth of a second, and the launcher hit the ground unfired. That sequence worked not because the sniper was faster or had a better rifle. It worked because the man was in the right place before the assault started, because the planning had accounted for the possibility, and because the doctrine said identify and eliminate Overwatch threats before breaching rather than reacting to them after. The difference between a plan and a doctrine is that a plan tells you what to do, whereas a doctrine tells you how to think. By the time an operator goes through a door, the thinking is already done, and we are not talking about the specific thinking for this specific door, because that will always be different. We are talking about the meta-thinking, the framework, the set of questions that have already been asked and answered before the breach charge is even placed. Where are the dogs? Where is the Overwatch threat? If the plan changes in the first 60 seconds, who has the authority and what is the decision process? What does the defender do when they hear the first breach, and how does that affect every single subsequent movement after that? These are not questions on a checklist that you tick off before going in. They are reflexes that were built through years of selection and training and operational experience, and they fire automatically in the seconds when conscious thought is simply too slow to be useful. The Americans arrived at this understanding eventually, to their credit. By 2005, Delta Force and the Naval Special Warfare Development Group were running joint operations with the Special Air Service in Iraq on an almost nightly basis as part of Task Force Night, and the learning genuinely went both ways. The Americans bringing technology and scale, the British bringing doctrine and patience. The after-action reports from that period describe a transformation in American close-quarters methodology that veterans of those operations later attributed directly to the joint work with the British. Beckwith had been saying it since 1962, and it took until 2005 for the conditions to exist where the Americans could finally watch it in real time, night after night, and see clearly what the difference actually was. Now there is one more thing worth saying here, because it is the thing that gets left out of every American analysis of this subject, and it is arguably the most important thing of all. The Special Air Service does not talk about any of this. Not publicly, not in memoirs written for the mass market, and definitely not in television documentaries where a retired operator sits in a leather chair and explains to a grateful nation how brilliant the regiment is. The institutional culture at Hereford has always treated public discussion of capability as a liability rather than an asset, because if the enemy knows what you can do, then the enemy plans for it, and if the enemy does not know, then the enemy makes assumptions. And as the militia in Basra discovered in September 2005, assumptions about what the British will or will not do in a given political situation can be fatally incorrect. The men who captured Campbell and Griffiths were not stupid. They had actually read the political situation in Basra with reasonable accuracy, and British forces were genuinely operating under constraints that limited their freedom of action. The stand-down order was real. Their assessment that the British would negotiate rather than assault was, institutionally speaking, correct. What they had not accounted for was the gap between the institution and the 64 men who drove through the gate anyway. That gap right there, that is the Special Air Service. And it always has been. Let us end on a number, because numbers have a way of cutting through everything else. In the 12 months between 2007 and 2008, a squadron and Delta Force were conducting joint operations in Baghdad on an almost nightly basis as part of Task Force Night, and in that period alone, a squadron arrested 338 people and killed 88, doing this night after night, building after building, in one of the most dangerous cities on Earth at the time. The casualty rate on the British side was lower than any comparable American unit operating in the same theatre at the same time, and we are not talking marginally lower here, we are talking significantly lower. The Americans noticed. Of course they noticed. Of course they noticed. And the after-action reports from that period describe something that reads almost like bewilderment when you go through them. How do they do it with less? How does a smaller unit with older kit with a fraction of the support infrastructure consistently produce better close quarters outcomes in the same environment? The answer is everything we have covered today, and it is not one thing that is the issue. It is all of it which was accumulated and then refined and then passed down from one generation of operators to the next, from the training philosophy to the kit discipline to the selection process to the doctrine to the 30 years of Northern Ireland, to the 80 years of doing this in places where the system failed and the man going through the door had to be right entirely on his own. The Americans have everything except that last part. And whether they ever fully close that gap, well, that is a question for the next 20 years, because the Special Air Service will have had another 20 years too. But for now, put them in a building in the dark. The building goes one way.